Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. Well, we, as many pundits and people across the world, I expect, are looking through the tea leaves or the remains or the bones of what happened on Tuesday night in the U.S. election, trying to understand exactly why Donald Trump won and who voted for him. Now joining us to help us further that process is Gerald Horne. Gerald joins us where he's doing some work in Washington. Gerald holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of many books, most recently The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, and the Origins of the United States of America. Thanks for joining us again, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
So there's some interesting numbers, but before we get into the numbers, let me say, last time we talked, and I was saying, well, I guess it looks like we're going to be dealing with a Clinton presidency. You stopped me and said, not so fast. I don't believe all these polls, and don't count Trump out. So you were kind of more right than most of the rest of us. What was your logic? And then we'll kind of get into why we think this happened.
Well, number one, Trump had been counted out as the Republican nominee, recall, by the pundits and by the pollsters, both of whom proved to be wrong. Secondly, one cannot discount the operation and the functioning of patriarchy and male supremacy in helping to undermine the candidacy of Hillary Rodham Clinton, which leads me to my overriding point, which is that I think that many of those who were being polled might have been embarrassed to suggest that they were going to vote for Donald J. Trump, since the mainstream media and a good deal of the U.S. ruling elite were so hostile to him. So I suspected that they would shroud their real choice and tell the pollsters what they wanted to hear.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, in fact, that there was one poll that I've mentioned a couple of times now, the LA Times USC, University of Southern California poll, which consistently had Trump up 3-4 points. And that's exactly what they did. They had done some surveys asking people if they would tell the truth to pollsters about voting for Trump. And apparently they then found that many people said they would not. And they factored that into their model, so that LA Times poll always had Trump up by 3 or 4 points. And within those people that said they wouldn't tell pollsters the truth were women, particularly white women, did not want to own up to it. And in fact, he did much better amongst the white women than expected. What do you make of that?
I think that's one of the most shocking aspects of this entire race, the fact that a majority of white women voted for a confessed sexual predator, Donald J. Trump. Now, I've heard some of the interviews of some of these women who voted for Trump, and they said, well, I was not voting for a person to be my lover or my spouse. I was voting for a leader, according to these people. I don't think that they understand that when a confessed sexual predator gets into the Oval Office, that sends a signal across the country with regard to male supremacy, with regard to groping women, with regard to being a sexual predator and how that's okay. So I think that they miscalculated royally, but we shall see.
I mean, a lot of liberal / pro-Democratic Party women overlooked and forgave Bill Clinton during those days and thought, opposed the attempts to impeach him and such. So I guess if a candidate fits more of your political objectives, you're willing to overlook many things.
Apparently that's the case, but I think that the National Organization for Women obviously has some work to do. I think that they may also have some explaining to do. But it's not just them. I think that we need to look at all of our organizations, starting with the labor movement, the AFL-CIO, headed by a miner, Rich Trumka. The miners, and of course there are not that many of them nowadays, but still, if you look at their bastion, which is West Virginia went overwhelmingly for Trump. If you look at Eastern Kentucky, where Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, was reelected just recently, a coal country in Eastern Kentucky went overwhelmingly for Trump. I think that as we sift through the ashes and try to make sense of what happened this past Tuesday and where to go from here, I don't think we can avoid the necessity for making some personnel changes at the top. And that very well may start with the AFL-CIO, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I've been discussing in a few interviews. I think when you look at the culprits here, assuming one doesn't like Trump, and in which case they're not culprits, I guess they're allies in some ways. But I think maybe the story of the election is Hillary and wanting to defend the legacy of President Obama, and President Obama, when he speaks, doing nothing but defend his legacy, and essentially saying, we've accomplished so much. Look how much better things are. Look how great America's already great, and all the rest. And for most people, that's simply not the case. And we all know the stat, and I keep saying it, but I guess I'm going to keep saying it. What is it? 90% of the increase in incomes after 2007, 2008, the increase in incomes went to 1% of the population. And whether people know that stat or not, most people are feeling it.
Well, I'm afraid that you're right. And I think that the media is framing the Trump victory as being a story of how the white working class, or they usually say the working class, propelled him to victory. But I think that that leads to the next question, which is, why didn't the black working class vote in the same way as the white working class? And that is a simple question that often evades and eludes the attention of the media. I think as well that when we do an autopsy of the Democrats' loss, it's apparent that Hillary was not the right candidate for this particular moment. I point to her position on Russia in particular. That is to say, this idea of having a safe zone, a no-fly zone in Syria, which would have brought the United States into conflict with Moscow, was not the kind of message to send to a population which already is reeling from a war in Afghanistan that's lasted more than 15 years, and from a war in Iraq that is lurching forward in an uncertain fashion. And so, in many ways, I hope that the Democrats do an autopsy on their foreign policy positions to begin with.
And I think one should always add, while Trump said these things, he is surrounding himself with people who are extremely aggressive in terms of Russia and China, people like John Bolton, Newt Gingrich, and of course, most importantly, Vice President Pence, who is more than likely maybe the person actually runs U.S. foreign policy. And they couldn't actually be more aggressive. But Trump presented this anti-interventionist face, which was a rhetoric, which was certainly popular. I think we should also add that the majority of workers did not vote for Trump. The majority of workers certainly voted Democrat. What Trump was able to do was, amongst one survey we've seen based on exit polls, he was able to increase amongst people who earn less than $30,000 or less. He was able to increase the Republican vote over the previous election by 16%. Still, most people that have less than 30% income did vote Democrat. By something like 53% voted Democrat. But it was a significant increase of 16% of those people went Trump. And then amongst income levels from about 30 to 50,000, that section of the working class, he increased his vote. Again, didn't win it overall, but he increased the vote by around 4%. And if you take those two together, an increase of 20% of the vote within the working class, and add to the fact that he held the almost all the traditional Republican vote, which is more wealthy and certainly predominantly white, that it makes the difference, that extra 20% that he gets out of the working class. The majority of white workers didn't vote for Trump, but more did.
Well, I think you're correct to suggest that Trump as a president will probably operate as a kind of aloof chairperson of the board while holding periodic rallies to feed his ego, and Mike Pence will be something like a prime minister. But that is particularly dangerous because that means that a lot of policy will be outsourced to these figures like Newt Gingrich and Rudy Giuliani and Chris Christie.
And John Bolton's name keeps coming up, and for anyone that's seen the movie, this is essentially Dr. Strangelove, John Bolton.
And I think one of the most startling aspects of the post-election scenario is the fact that the stock of the Corrections Corporation of America, which operates private prisons, has gone through the roof. I think that what they're looking at is the opening of a series of so-called immigration detention centers, because I do expect Trump to go forward and execute his anti-immigrant policy. I do expect that he will attempt to have mass deportations. And I dare say that despite the fact that the right wing has made noises about trying to dial back the prison industrial complex, they keep complaining about how it's costing so much money. I'm not sure if that's going to happen right now. And I think that the Correction Corporation of America, and more specifically their investors, don't think it's going to happen either, which is why their stock has been going through the roof ever since Tuesday.
And as has military manufacturers, Donald promised, and Pence has said, and John Bolton, as I said, emphasized that a massive rebuilding of the American military, whether they're interventionist types or not interventionist types on the Republican side, they're all on the same page when it comes to spending a lot more money on arms.
And as we've talked about on this program before, the election fundamentally was a choice between Hillary Rodham Clinton, who took a Russia first policy, that is to say, confront Russia first, and Donald J. Trump, who said confront China first, and Trump obviously won. But I think that part of the downstream consequence of that victory will be a tightening of relationship between China and Mexico. Both countries will be in the crosshairs by the Trump administration. I expect a massive Chinese embassy to be opened in Mexico City sooner rather than later, because of, as you know, south of the border, there's real panic right now. The peso has gone through the floor. There's a lot of talk about trying to undermine further the president who met with Trump and helped to give his candidacy a boost a few months ago. And I dare say that I expect many people's organizations from this side of the border to be heading to Mexico City as well to try to engage in acts of solidarity, so to help to prevent this mass deportation, which I think will start unfolding within about 75 days.
Yeah, I think it's a critical point. And I think some of the rhetoric of Trump that tried to win over African Americans in the election, I mean, it's quite contradictory. The law and order rhetoric clearly is very thinly veiled racism and, draws up stereotypes, blaming crime on young black men. But his attempt to say to urban blacks, look, what have the Democrats done for you? Nothing. And I've said this earlier, there's a lot of truth to that. But because he wants to isolate the Latinos and Hispanics, because there's no way he can fulfill any of his election bravado and promises if he doesn't start engineering mass deportation.
Well, and I think that one of the lessons from Tuesday's election is that voter suppression works. I think that voter suppression was the key to Trump's victory in North Carolina, was the key to why he did so well in both Michigan and Wisconsin. That is to say that a number of voters, particularly in Wisconsin, were not able to get the kind of ID that was necessary to vote. And with this Republican Congress being sworn in January, I think that one of the issues that will be higher on their agenda will be further measures to ensure that voter suppression takes place. The fact that presumably Donald J. Trump will be nominating the next member of the U.S. Supreme Court, who inevitably will be a conservative, will lead to the high court passing favorably upon such measures. So I think that there are dark days ahead for the United States of America. On the other hand, I think that Trump, and I don't mean this in a positive sense, may be the Gorbachev of the United States of America. That is to say, a man who's put into office to help to save, quote, white America, unquote, but that he will help to unleash a series of changes, particularly in the international arena, that will serve to undermine the United States of America. The problem, of course, is that so many people are going to be hurt, so many people are going to be damaged, so many people are going to be killed in the process.
Yeah, I agree. I was about to add to what you'd said about Russia. I mean, I heard the Russian parliament apparently applauded and Putin's happy. It's hard to imagine, especially at the level of Putin, such naivete that they actually believe Trump is going to run this foreign policy, or at least run it the way he said he was going to. His closest ally, apparently, on foreign policy is General Flynn. And General Flynn is all about regime change in Iran, Well, you can't, they all think, they being the right-wing hawks and Democratic hawks too, for that matter, they all see the overthrow of Assad as a stepping stone to the overthrow of the Iranian regime. It's part of the strategy of defending Israel's Lebanese front so that if there is an attack on Iran, Hezbollah has to be cut off from Iranian arms. So that again means the overthrow of Assad. And the whole strategy brings the United States into confrontation with Russia. Pence, who I still think is going to be running much of this, Pence, one of his most important or major critiques of Clinton's foreign policy was that she's soft on Russia. She's too weak on Russia. If the Russians really think that Trump's going to be running this stuff, I think they're making a very big mistake. And I think with the Cheney-type cabal, the Project for New American Century-type cabal, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, the same kind of players, and maybe even some of the exact people behind the scenes, they're back in the White House.
Well, I think that's possible, but keep in mind that many of the neocons actually supported Clinton. Robert Kagan of the Brookings Institute, and recall that it's his spouse that was a key figure in terms of the changes in Ukraine in February 2014.
But I read a document by Kagan quite recently, which came out in WikiLeaks, and it was a document that was sent to Obama in 2004. And Kagan actually calls for a negotiated deal with Iran to limit their nuclear capability. So some of these neocons are not all on quite the same hawkish page as Pence and the Cheney types. There's certainly differences there.
Well, I agree that, as I've suggested, that Mike Pence will be a kind of prime minister, with Trump being sort of like the equivalent of Queen Elizabeth, until it comes to questions like immigration and building a wall and worsening relations with Mexico. But even if there is this cabal in Washington under the Trump regime that will want to have a downturn in relations with Moscow, it's not going to be easy. Putin is headed to Japan within a few weeks, and I expect even closer relations between Tokyo and Moscow that exist today, and the relations are very close. I mean, recall that Shinzo Abe, the prime minister, did not boycott the Sochi Olympics, for example, even though that was the mandate coming down from Washington. As a matter of fact, if you count up the number of times that Putin and Abe have met, it almost rises to the level of the number of times that Xi Jinping of China and Putin have met. And they've met so many times that people are almost beginning to talk. Not only that, but Putin and Russia had military maneuvers just a few weeks ago with Pakistan, of all nations. That is to say that the sanctions regime against Russia and the attempt to isolate Russia is not working out very well. So even if there is a wish to have a downturn in relations, I'm not sure if that wish will be fulfilled. And in any case, one of the things the United States has to move away from is this delusional obsession and fixation with Moscow. I mean, John McCain says that Russia is just a filling station masquerading as a great power. That is to say that because it exports so much oil and gas, that's the only advantage it has in its economy. Well, if he's correct, why is there so much attention to this nation? And it's very upsetting because, of course, Russia is the nation with nuclear weapons that could ultimately present the stiffest challenge to U.S. national security.
Yeah, I mean, this is speculative, I guess. I don't think, provoking, confronting Russia is the number one objective here of this group. They want to be seen to be stronger, seen to contain. But I think the real objective, as much as the Bush-Cheney foreign policy objective from day one was the overthrow of Saddam in Iraq, and that everything else was subordinate to that, including whether you defend the country from terrorist attacks or not, the Afghan war. Everything they had was aimed at overthrowing Saddam as part of this strategy towards regime change in Iran. And I don't think this has changed. These guys are going to come to power with the same objective. Flynn has this general, his Trump's advisor, he said on several occasions, the way to deal with the Iranian nuclear program is regime change. And so I can even imagine, maybe Trump will even try to see if Russia could be made a deal with, he's the grand negotiator, to bail on Assad throw Assad under the bus, let the Americans go after Iran, and we'll give you something. Now, I have no idea whether the Russians would go for such a thing, but I can imagine in the heads of these people, that's what they might be thinking. And there's little doubt from all of their public statements that the crosshairs of where they're heading is Iran.
Well, that may be part of their thinking, but I'm not sure if it'll be possible. First of all, I'm not sure if it would be in Moscow's best interest to turn its back on Syria and Iran, because that just means that the hawks in Washington get closer to Moscow. Secondly, as President Rouhani of Iran has suggested, the nuclear deal was not just a deal with Washington on a bilateral level. It was a multilateral deal sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. Now, of course, Washington is quite adroit and adept at turning its back on international law and the Security Council in the first place. But then there's the financial interest. Total of France, the major oil company, has just executed a major deal with the Iranians concerning oil. The Chinese, of course, have major investments in Iran as well, or major deals, I should say, in Iran as well. So if they want to go back down that path, good luck, but I'm not sure if it's going to work.
All right, well, all of it, every one of these scenarios is rather dangerous. And I don't think most people that voted for Trump had any idea what they were getting into. Thanks very much for joining us, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.